Hello, my name is David Pearson. This morning I was in the 4th and 5th grade classroom teaching them a class, and I teach about the Bible. And when I speak to the 4th and 5th graders, my goal is to take biblical principles and relate them to the world around us so that we can get a better view of how God sees the world, so that we can understand what our job is and how we should react to the things around us. And so today we talked about leaders. And what we did is we took a number of biblical leaders and we read about them, and then we put them into 3 different categories. And here's the categories we put them in. We have the category of good leaders, we have the category of carnal leaders, we have the category of evil leaders. Now, good and evil are opposites, and originally I called this the converted column, but good seemed more appropriate because it's the opposite of evil and it's easier for people to understand the difference. But I also wrote the word pagan here in the evil column, and this one says godly. So it's pretty easy to think of a leader who falls into this category. It's someone who acknowledges the one true God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and has dedicated their life to serving that God 100% no matter what. A leader who falls into the evil category is pretty much the opposite of the first one. That is someone who has rejected God and who purposely violates God's standards and God's laws. It's pretty easy to come up with examples of those types of leaders throughout history as well. The middle category is a little more difficult. It's called carnal. And I explained it to the students like this. This is someone who's not explicitly evil, but they are just worldly. And as we get into some examples, you'll get a better idea of what I mean. But to explain it a different way, this is what I said. You have, in most countries, and really the world, a spectrum that most everyone falls on, and most everyone falls in the middle of the spectrum, and they're moderates. And then on either end, you have radicals. And you can define radical many different ways. Just for today, I use the example of radical Islam, because a lot of people have heard of that term, and a lot of people use that term. And then on the other side, I just put radical Christians. So I gave the example of the fact that the people in this category, which is most of the people you know and most of the people alive in the world today, want pretty much the same thing. They want to go to work, they want to live in a nice house, they want to have a good family with kids, they want to be able to drink beer or alcohol, they want to be able to date or chase the people who they find attractive. If they see someone that they like to try to pursue that person. And so that can describe most people in America. That could also describe, let's say, for example, most people in Iraq. Let's talk about the radicals on either side. You have radical Islamists. And the example I used was you have 3 guys with a stick of dynamite, and they're wearing their sandals and their headband, and they're screaming Allahu Akbar. And then those 3 are up against a squad of American soldiers. And when the American soldiers point their weapons at them and say, surrender, those 3 radicals are not going to surrender. They're going to shout and yell, and they're going to throw their stick of dynamite. Even if they know that it'll get them killed. There's nothing that could change their minds because they're radicals. Now let's talk about the radicals on this end. Let's say there's 3 guys also in this scenario, and these 3 guys are asked to bow down to an idol. Let's say the king makes an image of himself, a giant image, and tells the 3 radical Christians, you will worship my image. Well, the radical Christians are going to say no. They're going to refuse to bow down because they only worship God. And so no matter what happens around them or how much force is brought to bear on the situation, the radical Christians are going to refuse to bow down. Everyone in the middle, which is most of us, is going to follow whichever one of these presences is strongest. And these aren't the only examples of radical ideologies. There are many out there. But the distinguishing feature of radicals is there is nothing that you can do to convince them to change their mind. There's no amount of pain, there's no amount of oppression or ridicule that will make them change their mind. So let's keep that in mind as we talk about the different types of leaders. The first leader that we looked at is a gentleman by the name of Ahab, and his story is in 1 Kings chapter 16, starting in about verse 29. And when we go to the biblical account here, what we have is we have a list of the kings of Israel in order. We have Nadab, we have Baasha, Elah, Zimri, Omri, and then Ahab. And in verse 29 of chapter 16 it says, "In the 38th year of Asa king of Judah began Ahab the son of Omri to reign over Israel, and Ahab the son of Omri reigned after Israel in Samaria 22 years. And verse 30 says, "Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord, above all that were before him." And then it goes on to say that he built altars to Baal, which is a false god. And it says in verse 33, Ahab made a grove, which was a place that people went to worship other gods. It was a stand of trees that had pagan significance, and people would burn incense there, and they would chant, and they would follow their religious practices when they worshipped Baal and other pagan gods. And it says in verse 33, Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel that were before him. So we ask the question, which category of leader does Ahab fall into? And the students very quickly put him in the evil category because the Bible is pretty clear. He goes in that category. Okay, the next leader we did was Pharaoh. And as we know, Pharaoh is not a name, it's a job title like president or ruler or king. And so this is the Pharaoh during the time of the Exodus. And his account is in the book of Exodus, and it's in chapter 1. And there's a lot about Pharaoh, but we're going to read just a couple verses, starting with verse 10. And it's describing that there's a problem in Egypt because the Israelites have become numerous. And the Pharaoh doesn't like that because he thinks that if there's ever any problems, the Israelites will be able to rise up against the Egyptians. And so he thinks of a solution. In verse 10 he says, "Let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. And it come to pass, when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore," here's Pharaoh's solution, "they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses." So what it's saying is that Pharaoh made the Israelites slaves. And then we have one other piece of information about what Pharaoh did in verse 15. "The king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name was one Shiphrah and the other Puah. And he said, When you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him, but if it be a daughter, then she shall live." So what this means is, when the people who were responsible for delivering the babies, when they got a customer who was an Israelite, their instructions were, if they saw that the child was a boy, to kill that child. So based on those two pieces of information, the question is, what category do we put Pharaoh in? And the students chose to put Pharaoh in the evil column. Our next example is Nebuchadnezzar. And you can find his story in 2 Kings. And we'll go to chapter 24. And what Nebuchadnezzar did is he came up against the city of Jerusalem and he besieged it. And he conquered the city of Jerusalem and he took many articles of spoil out of the temple and the riches of Jerusalem. And then he also took exiles, captives. He took the best and brightest among the people and only left the poor and the laborers. And in our class, we've been talking a lot about conquest. We told the story about Alexander the Great and the regions that he attacked and took over. And so we knew that this was pretty common practice, was for the invading power to take the wealth and the brightest minds out of that culture so that their culture would become even greater, and the culture that they had defeated would be left with poor, ignorant people. And so that's what Nebuchadnezzar did. 2 Kings 24, and it tells that story in verse 10. And then it says that Nebuchadnezzar set up he deposed the king of Jerusalem, and he made Mattaniah, his father's brother, king in his stead, and changed his name to Zedekiah. So he established his own king of Jerusalem that he could control. So given that story, we voted to put Nebuchadnezzar in this column. Okay, now, if you think about, there's many leaders in the Bible that we can do this example or this exercise with. And if you think about the leaders in the Bible, especially some of the most well-known ones, it's pretty easy to come up with a lot of examples of the ones who fall into the evil category. But I tried to find some others, and so here's another example I came up with. And this is in Matthew chapter 27, and this is a fellow by the name of Pilate. And when the Jews decided to get rid of Jesus because they didn't like the things he was saying and the fact that he was claiming to be God, they brought him before several authorities, and Pilate was one of those authorities. And the story of Jesus before Pilate is in chapter 27 of Matthew, and it starts in verse 11, and it records this back and forth between Jesus and Pilate. And in verse roundabout 15 and 16, it says that Pilate's custom was to release to the Jews a prisoner at about this time of the year. And since the Jews had brought Jesus before him, but Pilate had cross-examined him and not found any evidence to keep him or to charge him with, he told the people that he would bring a murderer before them by the name of Barabbas, who was a prisoner. Then he asked them in verse 17, "Whom will you that I release unto you, Barabbas or Jesus, which is called Christ?" And in verse 20 it says, "The chief priests and elders persuaded the multitude that they should ask Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor answered and said unto them, Whether of the twain will ye that I release unto you? They said, Barabbas. Pilate saith unto them, What shall I do then with Jesus, which is called Christ? They all say unto him, Let him be crucified. And the governor said, Why? What evil hath he done? But they cried out the more, saying, Let him be crucified. When Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing, but that rather a tumult was made, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person, see ye to it. Now, when I read this story, and many of us are familiar with this story, the 4th and 5th grade students had no problem putting Pilate in this category. In fact, it was almost a unanimous vote. But they didn't even have the benefit of this example because I hadn't explained it. But what we want to understand about these people is they will tend to adhere to a certain idea of good and bad and morality and right versus wrong. But they are very susceptible to being swayed by the will of the people. So as we see here, Pilate knew that it was wrong to put to death or to convict or to imprison an innocent person. He knew that was wrong. But when it came down to it, the cost of him losing his job or gaining disfavor with the people wasn't worth the sacrifice it would take to do the right thing, and that is why he gave them permission to crucify Jesus. So, if he had fallen into this category, we know that despite or no matter what the outward pressure or influence on him, he would still maintain the correct or the righteous judgment, and he wouldn't be swayed. But since he was carnal and not converted, it was easier, or he was more susceptible to the crowd. Okay, now the next one I used is the last example, and I kind of played a trick on the students because I used an example of a leader that we already talked about today. This is the same person, this is Nebuchadnezzar, but this is a little bit later in the story, and we pick up the story in the book of Daniel. And it's chapter 4, starting about verse 30. And remember, this is the leader who conquered Jerusalem and conquered many other lands, and he had established himself a grand kingdom. It was a powerful kingdom, it was a wealthy kingdom, it was a beautiful kingdom. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar owned several of the wonders of the ancient world. And so in verse 30 we find him gloating or marveling at the kingdom that he's made for himself. And he says, "Is this not the great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty?" And many of us have heard this story as well. It's a favorite with Sunday school teachers. But after Nebuchadnezzar asks this gloating question, God says to him, "You're not as powerful and wonderful as you think you are. In fact, I am much greater than you, and I'm going to demonstrate that. I'm going to show you." And so what he did is he afflicted him with this mental disorder whereby Nebuchadnezzar acted like a cow. He thought of himself as livestock rather than a human. And instead of walking on both feet, he walked on all fours, and he ate grass, the Bible tells us, and his hair and his fingernails grew long. And after 7 years of life like this, God healed him and restored him so that he understood in his mind that he's a human again. And he had this reaction in verse 34. "I, Nebuchadnezzar, lift up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me, and I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation." And in verse 37 he says, "I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth, and his ways judgment, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase." And so I asked the students, which category does this Nebuchadnezzar fall into? And they said, he's converted now. So we see a difference in his character from this category to this category. And because he's giving praise and honor and acknowledgement to the God of the universe, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we'll put him in this category rather than this category. These are just a few examples, and we could take many more from the Bible, but you can also use this to categorize leaders around the world throughout history, but also today. And in fact, I gave them the example, many of the leaders in Europe would fall into this category. They believe in doing the right thing, but they are very susceptible to being swayed by public opinion. And so they make choices that aren't good, but by the time they realize that they're wrong, there's not a lot they can do to fix it. So before we close the whole illustration and bring it around to our world today, especially the world of politics, let me give you one more way to look at this. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about God's standards, the institutions God has set up. And then we're going to put them all in this category and talk about the fact that you don't have to be a Christian to adhere to God's principles or to honor God's ways. And so we're going to put just a few examples up here of institutions that God set up or defined. And the first one is in Genesis. Most of these are in Genesis because that's the beginning of the story where God sets everything up the way he wants it. And the first one is in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. And that verse says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them." And this is really easy for the students to do as well. We asked, how many genders did God create? And the answer is 2. Male and female, the Bible tells us, and there are no other options. So the question is, can someone recognize and understand that God made 2 genders, male and female, without being a Christian? And the answer, of course, is yes. There are many people who have not been converted who recognize that there are 2 genders made by God, male and female, and there are no other options. The next institution we find in Genesis chapter 2, and let's start in verse 23. Adam said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore," this is the story about Adam and Eve, "shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh." And again, this is 4th and 5th graders. This is pretty simple for them. I asked, what do we call that when a man leaves his father and his mother and cleaves unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh? And they got it right away. That's called marriage. And God says marriage is one man and one woman. So we ask the question, can someone believe that marriage is between one man and one woman, just like God ordained it, without being a Christian? And the answer, of course, is yes. There are many people who can believe that marriage is between a man and a woman who aren't Christians. They've not been converted. They're worldly. They're carnal. But they still know that this is correct. Let's go for another one, and this one has 2 verses, Psalm 139:13 and Jeremiah 1:5. I would like to start with Jeremiah. Psalm 139 is the one that says, God says, "I formed you, I knit you together in your mother's womb. I formed your inward parts." And that's talking about a baby, a child that's not yet been born. And in Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5, God says to Jeremiah, "Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee, and before thou camest forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee, and I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations." So this is God talking to Jeremiah saying, before you were even born, I knew you, and I had a plan for your life. And so, to us, what that means is, life is sacred. And I didn't know exactly how to phrase this. This is just the phrase that I came up with. God honors life, especially unborn life. He created humans, and he has a plan for them even before they're born. He has ordained their life. Let's look at another one in Genesis 9:6. And we're almost done. We have one more after this. This is right after the flood, and God's making a covenant with Noah. This is where he says, "Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth." And then he gives them a bunch more standards. And in verse 6, it says, "Whosoever sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man." So what this means is, God ordained the death penalty for murder, and he intends that man, in the form of government, carry it out. Not men individually, because that's vengeance, but that when someone commits murder, God requires them to be put to death. That's called the death penalty. So before we get to the last example, let me ask the question. Can someone believe and know that life is sacred without being a Christian? Can they believe that it's not all right to kill children, even if they haven't been converted? And the answer is yes. Can someone believe that if you commit murder, you deserve the death penalty? And as God explains it, because you have killed something that I made in my own image. We say yes, someone can believe in the death penalty without being converted. And the last one is a little bit obscure, but I think it's worthwhile to bring it into the conversation. If you don't like this one, you don't have to add it into your own consideration. Let's go to Genesis 10:32. Again, this is shortly after the flood, and Genesis 10 is the chapter that tells us the descendants of Noah's sons. So all the sons of Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their offspring. And it's just a list of names for the whole chapter. And at the end, the very last verse says, well, let's start in 31. These are the sons of Shem after their families, after their tongues, in their lands, after their nations. These are the families of the sons of Noah after their generations, in their nations. And by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. So when you think of this phrase, the nations were divided on the earth after the flood, we have this principle ordained by God. Mankind is divided up into nations and meant to spread over the whole world. And I realize this is something that we don't talk about very often, but my claim is that God ordained man to live in nations. And for a proof, the very next chapter after the one that I read talks about the story of the Tower of Babel, where all the nations wanted to have one language, one government, one set of rules, and live all together. And God split them up, changed their language, and drove them all over the world. So, here's my question. Can someone believe that mankind is meant to live in nations and not be a Christian? And the answer is yes. So this is my metric by which we can look at the categories of leaders. So the last thing that I told the group was there's a practice common in schools where the students in the school vote for who they want for president. And I didn't even know about this practice until someone called our school, someone from the newspaper, and said, would you like to put an ad in our Kids Vote circular? And I didn't even know that was an event. And one of my friends said, yes, when the adult or the parent goes to the ballot booth on election day, there's a little one set up for the kids so that they can vote too. And many of the schools have votes or elections where the kids can vote who they want to be president. And so I wanted the students to think of our current presidential race in this viewpoint. So the last question I asked was for them to think about our current election for president. And the teachers were in the room too, so when I was talking about it, they were shaking their heads and nodding too. So before I asked the question of who falls into what category, we asked the question, if you got to choose the leader who ruled over you, would you choose someone from this column, or this column? And everyone said they would like to have someone in this column. They'd like to be led by a good, godly person who's been converted and worships and recognizes Christ, God, as the one true God. But if that wasn't an option, we asked the question, between these two categories, which category would you rather have a leader from? And we selected this category. And even though this isn't ideal, if you think about the lives of the people who were ruled by these leaders, and the lives of the people who were ruled by leaders in this column, and then the lives of people who are ruled by leaders in this column, you know that the lives of the people ruled by the leaders in this column are better than these lives. But the lives of these people are also significantly better than the people who are ruled by leaders in this column. So when we think about our current presidential race, let's think about how many options we have of leaders who fall into this column. And when I asked that question this morning, everyone shook their heads and said, no, we don't have any options of leaders who fall into this column. And in our room, it was 100%. But I know that there are evangelicals and there are Christians who try very hard to make the argument that we have options for presidential candidates of people who fall into this category. But it's a very hard claim to sell. And I personally listen and respect those people, but I do not believe them. I don't think you can make the case that we have any presidential candidates this time around who fall into this column. However, I do believe that we have options that fall into this column, and we have options that fall into this column. And I didn't even mention the name of any of the presidential candidates, but if you look at these institutions that were ordained by God, and then you ask yourself the viewpoint, the platform, the opinion, the belief of the major candidates running for president, or all the candidates running for president really, and you ask yourself, which presidential candidates believe that there are two genders, male and female? Which presidential candidates believe that there are more than two genders? That you could be a male or a female, or some variation thereof, or some mix in between, or one day and one a different day. And then I ask the question, if you believe that there are multiple genders and sexualities and sexual orientations, can you be a good leader? And the answer is no. If you reject the God-ordained gender distinction, then you cannot be, not even in this category, you're falling into this one because you're rejecting what God ordained. You are purposely making a choice. You're not in the middle like a moderate who just goes with the flow, whatever culture dictates. You are on the evil side. If you believe that the definition of marriage is other than a man and a woman, like it could be two men, or two women and a man, or any variation thereof, you fall into this category because you're rejecting God's design. You're rejecting the definition of marriage that God ordained. If you believe that parents should kill their children, remember we put Pharaoh over into this category quite easily because he had children murdered. If you believe that parents should be able to kill their children, then that puts you in this category, not this one. Because a carnal person can understand and believe these things, but a person who believes the opposite of what God ordained and what God designed falls into this category. If you believe that people who commit murder should be allowed to live and then the government should pay to have them incarcerated for the rest of their life, you are going against what God set up when he said, "Whosoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed." And then finally, if you believe that all of humanity on earth should speak a common language, have a common currency, be governed by an overarching set of common principles, and not have borders, you're rejecting God's design when he intended that mankind be distinguished by nations. So when you think about the presidential candidates and how you're going to cast your vote, there are many opinions that you've been exposed to. And in the end, it will come down to your conscience and what you believe before God. but I wanted to give you one more way to look at the character and the beliefs of leaders through these three categories.